This one. Hello. Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to everyone in this meeting. It's 7:03, and we are just starting our meeting now. So, apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Councillor Surinder Jassal.
And Councillor Charan Sharma. Urgent matter have not been notified. Declaration of interest? None. Matter to be considered in private? No. Yeah, can I just come to the minutes to agree the minutes of meeting held on 21st of September 23? Are we agreed? Thank you. So, Ealing Council's local development plan update. This is a main item for discussion tonight, and the theme of this meeting is housing. And our attention tonight will be primarily focused on the housing need, housing strategy, and housing delivery. People need to live somewhere. They can do that by buying home or renting home. If they are unable to do that, either they will be living with someone, living with their parents, or living with other, or become homeless. The council plan agreed last year emphasized the importance of providing more genuinely affordable housing. Clearly, if we don't plan for enough housing to meet our need, our local plan won't be approved, and will also be vulnerable to be unpleasant development. So this is really important issue, and it is raised number of complex and contentious matter. As in previous committee, I therefore wanted to use tonight's meeting to provide an opportunity to explain and clarify the council emerging plans and provide any feedback for my cabinet colleagues. A wealth of information has been published with the agenda. And in addition, we have 3 presentations tonight, including a keynote presentation from consultant helping to draw a new housing strategy for the council. And I will take this opportunity today to introduce and welcome Jennifer Peter, our new Ealing Assistant Director, Planning, Design and Sustainability. Thank you for joining us, Jennifer, tonight. So without any further delay, can I introduce Sam Cadbert, our Principal Planning Officer, to briefly provide some context to the discussion around housing need and relevant evidence-based report, please. Sam, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Ian, if you could load the first presentation. Thanks very much. Next slide, please. So I'm here to talk primarily to the point of housing needs in Ealing, of which the principal and most significant parts are the SHMA and the LHNA, 2 separate studies that were done in order to support the Regulation 18 draft of the local plan, which was published last year. These are 2 separate studies, although the latter is mainly an update to the former. The LHNA itself serves a number of primary tasks, the most important of which is to analyse affordable housing needs and to provide a breakdown by size and tenure of those needs. It's important also that the LHNA reflects the London Plan target set for Ealing, which is of 21,570 units over the 10 years to 2028/29. Important also, I think, to understand that the LHNA covers the period 2021 to 2041. That's effectively straddling the likely local plan period, going both sides of it and providing evidence, therefore, before the plan period starts and after it's projected to end. And also to understand that it analyses needs for the whole borough. That's including Ealing's portion of OPDC, but it does provide for disaggregation of those figures into the Ealing Local Planning Authority and OPDC itself. Next slide, please. How then does the LHNA go about establishing housing needs? Well, effectively, it's primarily concerned with the affordable housing needs, and it looks at these in two ways. It looks at current unmet needs, which are effectively knowable in detail now, and it calculates these by including all households that are currently homeless, all households in temporary accommodation and concealed families that currently live as part of another household, and also adding in any overcrowding, particularly in the social or private rented sector, and any other houses that we have reason to believe, or households that we have reason to believe are not currently reasonably housed. As you'd expect from that collection of data, there's a high degree of correlation between our current unmet needs and the existing housing register. So that's a first point of audit to check that we're taking the right approach to current unmet needs. However, it also needs to include projected needs, and it does this defined mainly into three categories, looking at new households expected to arise that will materially add to housing need in the borough, looking also at households that will or are projected no longer to be present and will therefore reduce housing need, and finally checking for changes in circumstances that may affect existing households within the borough, so among those households that would have been captured by current unmet needs. The approach that the study takes to do this is largely based on current ONS methodology and included the then then recently published mid-year estimates for the census. Next slide, please. One final piece of context important to understand and take into account in reaching the LHNA estimations of need are the various provisions of the London Plan. That includes a target for Ealing, as I said at the beginning, of 21,570 units over 10 years, of which 4,240 are known as small sites. The significance of that is primarily that they're expected to arise as windfall from among the rest of the borough's housing stock and from minor developments, and they don't therefore have to be accounted for in the housing trajectory. That's a point that my colleague Ian will return to in his presentation later this evening. So this London Plan target also then forms the local plan target on an annuated basis of 2,157 units per annum, and that will roll over beyond 2028-2029, which was the original duration of the London Plan target. If we step back for a moment and look at what that means, including OPDC sub-area, that would give a notional target for the whole borough, for the political boundary of the borough, of 2,769 units per year. And by way of context, that is as opposed to the 4,709 units per annum that would arise for Ealing using the standard method. It's important to understand whole borough needs, that is that figure inclusive of OPDC, particularly because most data that housing needs looks at is produced on the basis of political boundaries, but also because housing nominations will arise as a consequence of development in OPDC, and therefore the LHNA gives us a basis to to understand how those may be deployed to meet housing need. However, that data, the data inclusive of OPDC, can be disaggregated, and the purpose of the LHNA is mainly to inform the housing split in any case, not the absolute number of units, which is already established by our London Plan target. Finally, it's worth also recalling that the London Plan, in fact, sets our overall affordable housing provision target. That's not an output of this housing need data, and that target is 50% of overall housing delivery in the borough. Next slide, please. Finally, the last component of the LHNA in understanding housing need are three forms of specialist housing, starting with housing for older people, which may arguably be the largest of these forms of specialist housing. The London Plan does in fact provide what it calls a benchmark figure for Ealing of 200 units per annum. And there is recent evidence, not least from our neighbouring borough of Brent, of inspectors supporting the adoption of that benchmark at EIP, not least because of the social benefits that arise from properly housing the population, but also there are relevant efficiency benefits from addressing what would currently be regarded as under-occupancy of housing by people whose housing needs have shrunk. However, the nature of a benchmark, the reason that it is a benchmark in the London Plan rather than a target, is that it's inherently difficult for the planning system to deliver. And it's important to note that both in terms of how needs add up in total and also how the plan approaches these in policy terms. Similar is need for co-housing. To the extent that we can generate data about need for co-housing, it actually tends to show a preference among households that would normally use it, which is to say households forming one person, households under the age of 45. There is a general preference among that group toward various forms of house share, be that HMO or more informal house shares. That's not to say there may not be demand by individuals, there may not be preference by individuals to take up places in co-housing, but effectively the outputs of the study show that it's difficult to project need for this type of housing, and therefore we should look to individual applications to demonstrate on a case-by-case basis that there is demand for the co-housing product that they are providing. Finally then, student housing. Again, the London Plan does provide an overall target of 3,500 units per annum of purpose-built student accommodation. However, that is not targeted individually to boroughs, nor indeed is it benchmarked, which reflects, in fact, the nature of student housing need in London as constituting a single housing market rather than distinct borough-level submarkets. And it's worth noting that delivery of student housing in Ealing and indeed other boroughs has historically been quite inconsistent. So that effectively leaves us in a similar position to co-housing, that we should be looking on a case-by-case basis for those student housing applications to demonstrate their need. Next slide, please. So all of that taken together then brings us to the overall projection of needs, which is a reasonably complex chart, but I'll draw your attention to a few elements of it. The first of which is the chart is produced in relation to the whole borough target, that is to say, the need in the political boundary of Ealing, so including Ealing's subset of OPDC. That's important, as I said, because among other things, Ealing will be receiving housing nominations from the development that takes place in OPDC, and this will help us target that best to those most in need. The other thing to note is that this runs, as I said at the beginning, from 2021 to 2041. It's not Ealing's plan target. It is simply a projection of run of need over that period. The most important outputs of the chart really are the first three columns. So just to draw your attention to those, if we take the first two, that is those projected as being unable to afford market social rents and those unable to afford London living rents. those effectively constitute the 70% of affordable need, which is for affordable rent products of one or another sort. And the third column, those aspiring to home ownership and affordable home ownership, are those who would be the remaining 30% of our overall 50% target, that 30% in need of intermediate products of one or another sort. Next slide, please. There is, however, one final component of housing need in Ealing, that is the specialist housing type of gypsy and traveller housing, and I'd like to ask my colleague Steve Barton to give a brief update on that.
Thanks, Sam. So the evidence base for this is the Gypsy Travelling Show People Accommodation Travelling Assessment, GITANA. This identified a need for an additional 6 additional pitches in the borough, in addition to the existing provision of 24 pitches at Bashley Road. So we commissioned consultants, and their report is at page 193, councillors, of your bundle, prepared by 3 Dragons and published in June of this year. And they did an assessment of 16 sites across the borough, and it was decided that we would consult in a further round of Reg 18 consultation over the summer on 2 sites: a preferred site at Downsbarn Farm, part of the West London Shooting Ground, which is site 5A in the report, and as a reserve site, Northolt Driving Range, which is site 11 in the report. Now, again, just for the avoidance of doubt, the consultants were asked to look at a range of different options in terms of pitch provision, including the possibility of us not continuing to provide provision at Bashley Road. And on receipt of their report, and particularly based on feedback that we got from the existing traveller community, it was decided that we would retain Bashley Road, and so we would only be looking for the additional 6 pitches that are required. So as I said, that went out to public consultation for 6 weeks over the summer. We received 1,400 representations from across the borough, particularly from the Northolt area, because that's where the 2 sites proposed are located, and those are currently under consideration. An officer will be making recommendations very shortly for members' consideration to decide on next steps. Can I pass back to Sam, who's going to talk about housing policies and draw some conclusions on housing need?
That's great, thank you, Steve. So taking a step back then for a minute, if the LHNA and the Gypsy and Traveller Pitch Study represent the totality of Ealing's data on housing needs, how then is that reflected in the plan, or at least the Regulation 18 plan? We provided, to draw that out, an item in the Appendix C, which excerpts those policies mainly concerned with housing from the draft Regulation 18 local plan. I think it's fair to characterise the strategic policies as setting out primarily the broader reasons for providing housing and some of the impacts of that provision. And it is worth dwelling for a moment on the fact that that's not exclusively limited to direct effects of housing on general welfare, but in fact, the evidence base of the plan did identify a poor fit to housing stock as being a significant drag on the borough's economic growth, as well, of course, as the economic well-being of borough residents. So, as you'd expect, one of the more impactful areas of local plan policy. Equally, the DM policies, or at least those relating to housing, I think should be viewed mainly as technical policies designed to implement what's quite a comprehensive range of London plan policies and requirements for housing delivery in Ealing. That includes evidencing the 70-30 split of affordable rent to intermediate provision. Also, the proposed 40% affordable threshold in Ealing for the fast track. I should emphasise that's not a substitute for the overall 50% requirement for affordable housing, which remains, but instead it's an increase in the current 35% threshold for a fast track, that is to say, for schemes to proceed without viability testing, to a 40% threshold instead, which we think will ultimately deliver more affordable housing where viable on particular schemes. And finally, the small sites contribution, which captures those sites or those developments of 9 or fewer housing units, and which will provide, depending on size, a 10 to 20% affordable housing provision, where previously there would have been none. In relation to the Gypsy and Traveller pitches, which my colleague Steve spoke about a moment ago, these will be reflected, subject to the completion of an analysis of consultation responses, through a site allocation rather than through a specific policy. Next slide, please. So then, looking at the LHNA as a whole, what conclusions can we draw? I think overall it's quite clear that the outputs themselves constitute a very robust set of data on need, a very detailed set of data on need, which accounts, among other things, for both existing backlog and projected needs, for complexities around projected changes in occupancy and the efficiencies or otherwise that those may create in housing supply, and for the continued vacancy of units where that is unavoidable. It also provides actual affordability data, quantified most specifically by household size, which is very important to securing the correct types of housing against that housing need. And finally, it provides a basis for Ealing to inform any housing nominations that we receive from development in OPDC. All that being said, however, I think there is a clear need to interpret what can be quite a complex and abstract set of data on needs into something much closer to a delivery strategy, which itself will take into account other council assets and priorities that can be deployed in addition to the developer requirement to provide affordable housing. An approach which also reflects the spatial approach of the plan of seven towns within the borough, and finally to inform planning applications in the clearest and most straightforward way possible. And each of those tasks, those needs arising from this housing data, are things that we have asked of our colleagues currently preparing the housing strategy, and that will form the subject of the next presentation. Next slide, please. So that basically brings an end to the section on outline section on housing need, and I will hand back to you, Chair, for any clarifications from this presentation or from the report in general.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for comprehensive report. Is there any question or clarification, Councillor Ball?
Hit the wrong one, didn't I? Sorry. Okay. We're talking about the local housing needs assessment update, as well as the original one in 2018. And I'll just note that a lot of the data that's in there it is a long time ago. This is an updated report dated 2022. It talks about it didn't really take into account the census of 2021. And it won't be taken into account because it was basically drafted before that data came out. So I'm just wondering, are we missing a trick? And why have we got a report from November 2022 when a lot of the evidence base from the census is not included in this? And some of the, we're going back to 2013, 2011, 2012 in terms of getting our data, and the world has changed quite significantly in the last 2 years, 3 years. Movement of people from Brexit, etc., has changed. I just wonder, are we capturing the real data? Or I know that projections have to span over many periods. So I'm just wondering, are we at the right place? Second question I've got, completely different question. Travellers in the report, page 19, it says 3.9. In line with the consultant's recommendation, the council indicated a preference for down. Who has indicated that preference, and where's that preference come from?
Thank you, Councillor Ball. So Sam, one question for you and one question for Steve. So, yes, Sam.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the first question. I mean, it's a very fair question. I think the short answer is that the study makes use of the best data that's available at the time it was completed. That, as I touched on, does include the mid-year census estimates, although not, as you say, counts of the census outputs overall. I think the main thing really is that, or the main lesson that should be drawn is that what's important is not to let the housing evidence get out of date. So you take the most up-to-date evidence you can at the time of committing the study. Housing needs evidence is typically updated on a 3 to 5 year basis rather than the de facto 5 to 10 year basis the local plan is. And the policies, as we'll probably come into in more detail in later presentations, are specifically designed to let us take account of the updated housing need data as soon as it is available to us. So the opportunity on any updates or shifts to housing need patterns is not lost. And just as a footnote, you did mention Brexit, which again is quite a perfectly fair question, as indeed are the impacts of the pandemic on housing need. Those are addressed in part in the plan, although obviously with the same caveat that the effects that those two phenomena will have on housing need will continue to evolve and will ultimately be picked up by future updates on housing need.
Right. Thank you, Sam. Second part of the question with Gypsy and Traveller side, Steve.
Yes, so that was based on an assessment then of the deliverability and planning considerations of the site. So it's obviously a decision that was recommended by officers. Obviously, the final decision in terms of which site is taken forward, and as Sam indicated, it would preferably be a site allocation in the final version of the local plan, is one which members will take. But at the moment, we're currently assessing the representations. As I indicated, we've got quite a significant volume of representations. It'd be fair to say the vast majority of those who are objecting to one or both of the sites, and indeed many of the other sites that were assessed actually. So it'll be quite a difficult decision, but it'll be one that will be made in due course by Cabinet.
Yes, Councillor.
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of site allocations for other means. I don't understand why we're boiling down to one allocation in the local plan. Why don't we keep the door open for other? Because circumstances change, and I don't get, and I do object to the council indicated a preference, because the council haven't indicated a preference as it stands in the report. So two things there really. I wouldn't want to shut the door on other sites going forward, and I wouldn't be happy to do that in this forum. And yeah, I just think that was clumsy wording really in 3.9.
Just to say, obviously, there were two sites that were consulted on. The reason for doing that is obviously to also build in some degree of flexibility. So the Norfolk driving range was certainly also a front and centre of the consultation, was considered, and that was promoted during the consultation. Clearly, obviously, the desirability of one or both of those sites is obviously a matter for the council. I would suggest that you're absolutely right. We need to make sure the plan does have a degree of flexibility. Both of those individual sites in terms of deliverability have their own different and separate challenges. And clearly, obviously, you're absolutely right. The assessment of those challenges and difficulties of securing the site will obviously change over time. I would also just make one other further reference. Obviously, the inclusion of a site allocation in the local plan is not the end of the story, because obviously that meets our requirements in terms of national and regional planning policy to meet the identified need, as I say, the 6 pitches. But of course, we would still obviously need to acquire an interest in the land. And then secondly, of course, any proposal will be subject to a full and detailed planning application, and that would have to go through the MINSA in the normal way, even before you then start to talk about the feasibility and funding of such a scheme. So just to sort of put that in the sort of broader context, beginning of a journey, if you like, in terms of meeting the need, but it's an essential part of the examination of the local plan. To go forward at a local plan without identifying a need would put the whole local plan at risk.
Right, Councillor Martin.
And we're doing it as well. So we've put two sites, which I believe are currently both in the green belt, as our recommendations for the local plan. Now, that in itself is challengeable. I'm just wondering why we didn't go a bit further, considering, you know, when we did look at, I think it was 16 sites, considering the possibility that both of those could be ruled out legally.
Steve.
Yeah, and of course the evidence base obviously does provide a thorough assessment of all of those sites. Some of those are definitely not deliverable and are pretty much ruled out by the consultant for one reason or another. They might be in the floodplain, for example, or the difficulties around deliverability might be even more challenging. It is not unusual, and particularly in the London context, when we're searching for sites, to find that they are on greenfield locations. And whilst you're absolutely right in policy terms, they will be challenging in terms of dealing with, even if they're in the local plan, they would still be subject, providing that greenbelt designation remains, they would still be subject to the exceptional circumstances test. So the bar will be set very high. But inspectors have indicated flexibility where there has been an exhaustive site search in meeting the needs of the Gypsy and Traveller community. And so in much the same way as we were able to, for example, successfully make the case for a new secondary school on what was then metropolitan open land, exceptional circumstances can be granted. But I'm not suggesting the process is straightforward or will be simple. It's not.
Councillor Ball.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So also on this issue, so some sites are ruled out because they have neighbouring residential, but Downbarn Farm is the preferred one, which does have immediately neighbouring residential estate. So wondering how that squares. And also, as I understand it, the idea now is to retain Bashley Road, so there'd just be 6 plots. So again, Downbarn Farm, it seems to be a very large site, the whole farm being purchased for just 6 plots. Is that not right? No,
No, that wouldn't be the intention. I think that the cost of that would be prohibitive and would certainly ensure that such a proposal was certainly not viable. No, I mean, having mapped what 6 pitches would look like, the overall land take would be a relatively small piece of the overall real estate. It could also be argued that obviously given the nature of the activity on site, there would potentially be some complementarity between having a Gypsy and Traveller site and some of the activities that take place on the farm as well. But, you know, again, these are matters which will be looked at in detail at a much later stage in the process. My job, your job, as the Local Plans Committee, is identifying what the need is for the community and then trying to find a suitable and appropriate site. And this is always a very difficult and very, very complex and usually very contentious matter. That doesn't solve the problem, as your colleagues have just evidenced. It's the beginning of a journey, and assuming the inspector accepts whatever proposal you agree, because it's still open for the council to agree what, if any, site allocation does go forward. The inspector has then got to obviously find that proposal sound, so it's in the adopted plan. And then obviously we've then got to go through the next stages of obviously acquiring an interest in the land, coming up with a proposal which will obviously require funding and getting suitable planning permission. And that will not be a simple or straightforward task, as I explained earlier.
on that. So
Councillor Ball,
not had the answer to the residential bit, but coming back on that specific point, as I understand it, the owner of the land is maintaining that it's at the minimum viable size as a farm. So if they start, well, it's not the end anyway. As I understand it, it's being said that it's the minimum viable size to be a farm. So if you're chopping bits off, is it realistic that it'd still be a working farm? So that there'd be that complementary use?
I must profess, viability of farms and size is probably outside my area of expertise. I would just also point out, my understanding is the people who work the farm are leaseholders, so the freeholder is indeed a different person. So obviously the residential portion of the farm is a relatively small part of the overall land take. And obviously the intention would not be to co-locate the 6 caravans next to the farm buildings. It's still a reasonable chunk of real estate, so there would be some flexibility as to where the site could go.
Sorry, through you, Chair. No, I mean, my first question was about the point that there is a residential estate that's next to the site, and other sites seem to have been ruled out for that reason, but that applies to this one. I just wondered why that was the case.
I think all of the sites will have some residential properties within reasonable proximity of the site. I think it's by degree then, isn't it? It's a question of relativity. Yes, there is a settled community beyond the farm, beyond that site. But compared to some of the other sites we were looking at, which were in a much more suburban setting, I think by degree there is quite a marked difference.
Thank you. Councillor Martin?
Just to clarify finally though, I mean, I would say that there are inconsistencies in the Three Dragon report, and I can understand why Councillor Ball's picking that up, because there are other things like that where you feel like principles have not been universally applied. But for this evening, we have not yet reached a decision. I have to say, if we don't reach a decision, if we were to rule out both of those sites, I presume we would have to start again and do another consultation. So, but at the moment, we have not got to that stage yet.
I would certainly be advising Cabinet colleagues that it would be very risky to proceed with a site allocation which hadn't been tested at Reg 18.
Councillor Ball?
So my understanding is we're just establishing the fact that we do need 6 more pitches. We're not establishing the fact of where they are tonight or in the short term. We're just saying, and I don't think anyone disputes that we are short of 6 pitches for the travelling community, and we will find a site, and that's what our plan will say. It may or may not identify a site. I don't know. Does it have to identify a site, or does it have to indicate there are 6 sites that could accommodate that going forward?
We certainly have to identify sites. I mean, yes, we can be flexible in identifying more than one site. We've obviously assessed 16, and that 16 included Bashley Road. Again, I think it's something which we'll need to obviously look at. We're obviously assessing the representation. I understand this is quite a complex and very contentious matter, and obviously, members are going to have to make quite a difficult decision in the coming weeks and months. I would suggest that you need to weigh into the account, the feedback that we've got, and we will digest that for you and provide that information for you. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Ball. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Councillor Ball.
Sorry, on the matter, I just want to be clear on what our housing allocation numbers are from the report, because I've read different numbers throughout this report, 900 to 2,500 basically, and I just want to be clear what we're actually saying, what the conclusion of the report. I know what I think it is, but I might be wrong. So I just want to know from the officers, what numbers are we talking, and over what period of time? And the plan lasts for 5 years, is that right? But it's a 5-year housing supplier, isn't it? You need your mic.
Someone come on there.
Sam, could you clarify that the number and the time period, please?
So the plan, councillor, normally lasts for 15 years. There's a degree of potential uncertainty only over the start year, and that may be something that the inspector chooses to determine for us. It could run potentially from the London plan start year, which is 2019. It could run from the evidence-based start year, which is, as I said, 2021. Or it could be some other date, depending on the inspector's preference, but it would be for 15 years. And the housing target is the annualized London plan housing target. So it's the 2,157 units per annum over that 15 years, wherever those 15 years may fall.
And I didn't have my hand up.
Yeah, Constable.
Sorry, and that's based without any input from the census of 2021, which shows that we have a higher than we thought population.
So that figure comes from the London plan. Okay, so that's the target that's passported to us. Some of the higher figures that I mentioned, and they're there to provide some context. Some of those higher figures, particularly the figure over 4,000, that is coming from the standard method. Those are figures that have derived from government's assessment of what our target should be. I would also just say that it's not just based solely on housing need, it's also including a 35% uplift when they amended housing targets across the country, and they applied a 35% uplift for the 20 biggest cities in England, and obviously that included London. So when you read that debate that often takes place periodically between the mayor and government about what the true housing target should be, that's what they're alluding to. But for our purposes, for our local plan, the figure that will be tested on in the examination on our submitted local plan will be the 2157 figure, just for the avoidance of doubt. Yeah.
And sorry, just to jump in there, if I may, worth noting also that the Ealing target, as all London boroughs, has historically and will almost certainly continue to be set by the London plan. So we'll expect a further London plan process to come forward during that 15 years, and there will be an opportunity then to debate based on more contemporary understanding and need and capacity what Ealing's target should be in the next London plan, which will apply directly in Ealing as part of our development plan. It basically supersedes the local plan housing target in that respect.
Constable and Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thank you. So very general question, really. How do we ensure that these housing numbers are actually provided? Because well, we keep having planning committees cancel because schemes aren't coming forward. But before that, even when the planning committee was so there was the latest one happened, but there were a bunch of committees before that were cancelled. No, there were at least 2 in a row that cancelled.
Will you carry on with the
Anyway,
question?
it's not my main point. Before that, planning committee was approving lots of schemes, but a lot of them aren't being built out, and that's even before interest rates have gone up and so on. So you've got a situation where there's a huge amounts of schemes which are representing an enormous number of units that aren't actually being built. So how do we square that circle between actually getting the units available so that they provide housing, as opposed to just getting schemes that are in the pipeline and don't materialise because it's not the developer's financial interest to build them at the moment?
Thank you, Constable. Councillor Mendo, would you like to say something on that?
Yes, I would. So this is one of the most difficult parts of a local planning authority's remit. We don't actually build. We give permission for homes to be built, and We have in the past, over the last 4 or 5 years, been accused of building too many homes in Ealing. And the reality is, when it all comes down to the final, our AMR being published, clearly showing that we do not meet our housing need as currently expressed. So over the last 3 years, I think last year, if I remember right, the officers tell me only 900 homes were completed in Ealing against a target of 2,100. Therefore, we have a major problem in terms of, you may be aware that over 3 years, if you don't hit your targets, there is what's called the tilted balance. Yeah, tilted balance, which means we could get inappropriate development taking place in the borough where speculative investors come in and bid for, apply for planning permission on sites which we wouldn't want to see built on. And the inspector would rule that because we were not meeting our local plan targets, those permissions would be given. We had that instance with Manor Road in West Ealing. So therefore, it is vitally important we do, I'll say something political, because Liz Trust's bit really caused the major problem for many schemes which were coming forward. The schemes were coming forward, interest rates went shooting through the roof. There'd already been issues around material prices, etc., which has meant that many schemes in Ealing are stalled, because including some for the council, ourselves, the ones that Broadway Living are doing, they're facing the same issues that private developers are, that you can't physically or financially support the building of homes because they sometimes cost you more than what you could actually buy in the private market. You could actually go and buy the homes cheaper than what we could build them for, because the costs have gone up so much in many areas. So this is a fundamental problem with our local plan, and we have to do everything possible to make sure that we do build. But we are in the hands of what many residents call private profit-seeking developers. But the point is, if they can't sustainably build homes, they won't build any at all. So the only ones that are left are housing associations and the local council. And even housing associations are facing the same issue. So we will go through a quite difficult period in this next 18 months to 2 years. And really, Councillor Ball, there is nothing we can do unless you've got a few £1 billion in your pocket that we get grant from the GLA and from central government to help us to afford to build those homes. We can't go any further at the moment. We do what we can, but it is really difficult. And obviously every single scheme is opposed by many people, so they don't want us to build it in the first place. So that makes it even more difficult. But that's the situation we're in, and we have to do the best we can to provide genuinely affordable homes for our residents as far as possible. But it does take a lot of things to go right for a scheme to go forward and be built.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. We are pressing time, and we have got 2 more presentations to go through. So who is up? Councillor Martin, if you be quickly, that would be really grateful.
I'll try. So the first part is just a clarification of whether or not this document is going to remain a standalone document, sitting side by side with our local plan, the local housing needs assessment, or it's being incorporated, especially given this issue of it being different timescales. And the second question is, if we're anyway bound by the London plan targets, why are we going into so much work on our own to look at it?
Thank you, Councillor Martin. I will take last question, Councillor Discall, and then we will, the officer will reply that.
A bit of a two-parter. So I was kind of surprised with Councillor Ball's comments about underdeveloped or not developed planning applications, when, of course, we can only give approval, we don't do the building. But then clarify the point here that some of the very large developments have a rolling program of segmented development. So we expect them to be have a very long lead time. So that's some of the very large ones. The other thing is that to retain planning permission, you only have to do the very minimal amount of effort or work, break ground, and you can then roll that planning permission and retain it. And those are all national regulation and rules outside our control. Plus, we're also subject to flipping of sites. I've seen that in my own ward where planning permission's given and then the site is sold on and then flipped and re-applications come in. So there's a whole raft of reasons why, and we can't actually force building to take place. I mean, subject to the penalty of removing planning permission after a period of time, but we know that that can be got around by the smallest amount of work. But that's all national planning rules, nothing to do with Ealing, and we're within that national field. But just that's the first point. It's clarification so that Councillor Ball can understand that, and maybe others that want to raise those points can as well. But just in terms of there's lots of talks about the national government withdrawing planning targets. So have we got the contradiction of national government withdrawing planning targets and the London plan insisting on targets, and we're caught? But where are we in this sort of tug of war between these policies and decisions?
Good question, and I will take last question, Councillor Wall, and we will wrap up this presentation.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Councillor Martin asked my question, which is what's the point of these reports if we're going to take London?
Thank you. Steve.
So just to answer the question about the evidence base, I mean, that's exactly what it is. So it's your starting point for your review, and in particular, as Sam was explaining, has particular implications for affordable housing and the specialist housing provision that we spoke about. But the target is set in the London plan. And again, perhaps I would suggest councillors read the briefing that we prepared in the summer when we provided some interim figures. And I think we did bring it to a previous committee, in fact, where we provided some interim figures on the Reg 18 and tried to give some early responses to some of the key issues raised. And, you know, understandably, some confusion in the community because, of course, government says it's abolished housing targets. Yes, that is partly true, but I'm afraid it didn't abolish them for, as I was trying to indicate earlier, for the 20 biggest urban centres in the country, where not only were they retained, but there was also an arbitrary, without evidence, an arbitrary 35% uplift. That's where we get that 4,000 plus figure that I was referring to before. I have to say, quite frankly, if that was our target, I think I'd pack up and go home and retire, because there's not a chance in hell we're ever going to achieve anything like that in Ealing, despite the level of ambition, despite the great work that's being done to try and pump prime this particular sector. And we're beginning to get into areas around delivery, and we want to get to that towards the end of the meeting. But before that, we wanted to talk about our emerging housing strategy, because the evidence is just the evidence. The question then is, for policymakers, how do you reflect that in terms of your operational policy? And what we've said is, as well as having some borough-wide targets, we also want to be more granular. We want to go further than we did in the local plan. As Sam was concluding in his presentation, we also want to reflect that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work across the borough. And we want to reflect the fact that the local plan will comprise 7 towns, and we might want to have slightly refined policies or approaches in perhaps Southall as opposed to Acton or Northolt. And what the consultants, I'm hoping, are going to do is convince us, firstly, of the wisdom of that approach and provide some metrics to support that evidence base. And then perhaps we can then come to some of the delivery issues. I think it's been well rehearsed by members of the committee. I think there's a very good understanding of the current macroeconomic climate that we're working in. I would just end with this point. As a professional planner, the planning system is often blamed for the housing crisis. But, you know, as has already been ably demonstrated by many members around this table, planning committee over the years has resolved to grant permission for thousands of units. And then, surprise, surprise, some of those schemes come back like boomerangs because they were speculative. So if planners were judged on how many approvals, and you as members of the planning committee were judged on how many approvals and consents you give, we're doing really, really well. Unfortunately, the housing delivery test deals with completions. Now, short of sending my team out to learn bricklaying and plastering, there's not an awful lot more as professional planners that we can do. But we'll have a bit more of a discussion around some of the issues around delivery a little bit later in the meeting. But I would perhaps suggest, Chair, if we could bring in our consultants who are waiting very patiently.
That's
No, so the evidence base is the evidence base. Obviously, certain components of that will be reflected as necessary. And again, Sam highlighted those. But the key thing now in terms of evidence is distilling all of that into the council's housing strategy, which is still being drawn up. And the consultants are going to give us a sort of summary of where we've got to. I understand the housing strategy, you may know more as the portfolio holder, will be going to cabinet. Is it January?
It will be in January.
Yeah, that will be separate.
It's a separate,
Well,
yeah, it's separate.
But will form evidence to the local plan.
okay. Thank you, Steve. Without any further delay, can we go the core presentation tonight about the housing strategy, and is done by external consultant. So can I now introduce by video link our keynote speakers, Dr. Michael Bullocks, and he will set out more information about each 7 towns of the different strategy. Dr. Michael Bullock, could you introduce yourself and your team, please? And could you update us about the work you are doing it?
Good evening, Chair. If I could please, actually, I'm only one of the people involved in the study. The main lead is Maggie Rafalovich, so I'll get her to kick off if that's okay.
Hi. Right. Okay. Hi. My name's Maggie Rafalovich. I'm from a company called Campbell to Kell, and we're working on the housing strategy. I think might have met a couple of you already. The thing I wanted to say is part of the working on the strategy, it's very important to have a good evidence base to base the strategy and the ways forward and the action plan on. Now, I think somebody in the meeting mentioned the fact that the needs assessment was based on the previous census. So one of the things when we were actually commissioned to do this work, we actually told the council that what we wanted to do is take the needs assessment and update it, making sure that they've got the latest census data in there. And also that we were going to look in more detail about the differences within the 7 towns, because that's the approach that the council has got. So along with our colleagues from Mark 4, we've carried out this detailed needs assessment work. And I'm going to be handed over to different people, but I'm going to hand it to Helen Brzozowski, who actually has been leading on this particular piece of work, so she can actually explain what we've done, what we've looked at, and what the implications are for the different towns.
Thanks, Maggie.
Okay.
Thanks, Maggie. That's really helpful. And Mike, and of course, James McHugh is also on the call, who actually will be drafting your housing strategy. So you've got the full hit team here. And we've heard tonight, absolutely, that we've got significant housing need, significant affordable need, and the chair pointed that out. We've seen evidence around that, and that's absolutely right. But your evidence base, your housing market assessment, is very much a strategic position paper, which talks about what's needed across Ealing. And what, of course, you know and your officers know is that your towns are different, lots of similarities, but they are different, and therefore they need different kinds of solutions. And before we put the housing strategy in place, one of the things we've been commissioned to do is to look at those towns in some detail. So when the council talked about whether we had the updated evidence base, we have used the bang up-to-date evidence base, and there's no chance that I can share all that data with you, but we have issued this week to your officers a huge data set across your 7 towns of what they look like, who lives there, what the implications are around housing. And when I've finished to explain a little bit of that to you, Dr. Michael Bullock will talk to you about, so how do we try to plan for housing in those areas? Because rightly so, it was said this evening, one size does not fit all. And so what we're trying to do is help you draft your local plan alongside your housing strategy so that it aligns and you're doing the right things for the people who are living in Ealing. As I say, I can't do everything this evening. There's so much information, but I do want to share some slides with you that tries to show you what we've used to understand what you need and perhaps how your towns differ. So next slide, please. I appreciate that this is a lot of new evidence for people and it's also really difficult to take in, but this basically shows who lives in your borough. Now, I know you'll know lots of this, but each of these dots represent a postcode, and all it does is tells you the dominant household type that live there. So it isn't suggesting that no one else lives there. It's just telling you what the focus of that market is. And you'll see from that when we start with the darker green, they're your pre-family couples and singles, maybe your professionals, maybe your commuters, and you will see that they focus in Ealing hugely, as you might expect. They also focus around transport networks. We've got them on the map. So Southall is a classic. If you look at where Crossrail's kicked in, you will see lots more darker green signs where we've got pre-families. But you will see also huge numbers of dots of family households, young couples with children, and then families of school children age. And what this is saying is there's a massive family market around Ealing. And of course, all of those households need quite different approaches. We've also got older households who are our sort of oranges and reds of people who are in retirement. And whilst they're only pockets, they of course will be elsewhere. We've got some very distinct areas that we need to think about. So when we're looking at the numbers in the big picture and what the local plan is saying, or the draft local plan is saying, we need to think very carefully about what the options are for those households. Thank you. Next slide. But of course, when we look at what people need, we also have to look at what they can afford. We know there are some significant affordability challenges around Ealing, but how does that pan out? Well, here, if you just sort of go with the reds are people with higher incomes, and the blues are those with lower incomes, and the others are somewhere in between. What you're seeing is quite a gentrified core around Ealing, for want of a better term. So you get your higher income households that are choosing to live there. Acton is the same, although we've got some sort of group around Southern Acton, and you will see that going into other locations. But we've also got some real pockets of low income, low deprivation, and of course that means we need to respond quite differently. We've got some areas, I'm not showing you the slides tonight, where we've got quite high levels of owner occupation. So in Southall and Northolt, for example, we have. What you can see from this, we've got some of the lowest income levels. So how are those households going to live in the right type of house of the right size? How are they going to afford to improve it, or keep it well maintained? So there's some issues around housing condition there on your zero carbon agendas, and all of that starts to help us think about the interventions within each of the towns. We also know you've got significant levels of pre-1944 pre-war properties, Northolt in particular, but also across other locations. And in Northolt as well, we've also got low income families, and we've got higher levels of owner occupation. So it all adds into the mix that we need some very specific approaches to some of these towns. And that's exactly what we're working towards with your officers, and your local plans are reflecting that. Thank you. Next slide. We've heard already about older people tonight and the need for older accommodation. This table shows you, don't worry too much about all the figures in there, but it shows you age groups on the left, and then it shows you how that population age group, that cohort, will change by percentage between 2023 and 2040. And it's just really obvious, isn't it? Your lower, so your younger age populations are going to reduce. So you're losing people. So why are we losing people? Well, maybe it's because, but there's a whole range of reasons, but maybe part of it, and I know from experience, a significant reason will be because we haven't quite got the right housing offer. We haven't got the affordability of that housing offer, and we haven't quite got the right products to allow those people to move into the housing ladder. So people move with their feet and they go elsewhere. I buy entirely there will be the reasons why people are going, but that is what we see happening. So that drives us into the need for different intermediate housing type products. Of course, from the last slide I showed you about where different age groups live, we can start to drive in what we need to do and where we need to do it. But this slide's actually designed to show you about older people. The growth in older people by percentage is significant. By household numbers, it's not quite so awful. So while 62.7% of the 85 pluses, 85 plus age band will increase, it's 4,500 households. So not huge, but significant enough that we need to think about what the options are for them. We can't break that down into local towns. The data doesn't allow us to do that. We can make assumptions, but they will be highly caveated. So where will ageing happen? And therefore, how do we link the housing offer for older people? Because we often think about economic activity and driving first-time buyers and supporting second-stage movers and retaining students and key workers, and so we should. But we do also need to think about older people. And what this map shows you is where the locations are for the type of older person accommodation we've got in Ealing. And what that tells me as a first hit is we've got a decent offer. We've got some good extra care schemes, and the size of the circle is the scale of the scheme. So of course, that's the bigger ones, the better. But you've got a dominance of retirement housing. Now, I don't know your retirement housing, but when I've worked in other authorities, retirement housing often isn't quite fit for purpose, isn't quite what older people need, and while some of it will be, we do need to think really careful about that. And if you look at the likes of Greenford, for example, or Perivale, we don't have the choice perhaps that older people need. So, and when we look at the data that, I apologise, I'm not able to show you tonight because of timing, we see that we've got a fair few older people on lower incomes in their own homes that they own who may not be in the right type of accommodation. And of course, if they don't live in the right type of accommodation, what we're going to see is people not able to live independently for as long as they possibly can, maybe rocking up at A&E because of trips and falls, maybe more isolated, and therefore mental health challenges kicks in. And all of this as a council is a really expensive agenda, but it's also the agenda about supporting your corporate plan and allowing people to live more independently for longer, and their health and well-being very positive. So again, across our towns, we need to be thinking about what that says. Next slide. They're the only, forgive me, those are the data slides. So this is also then the property offer. So this just literally gives across your town the size of bedrooms. So 1, 2, 3 and 4 bedroom properties. We can break this down by flats and houses and so on. And you can see there that when we compare to the Ealing Borough, you can see who's above, you can see who's sort of behind that curve. Acton, as you'd absolutely expect, is higher in those sort of smaller accommodations. We talked about the pre-family accommodation, but you can see someone like Perivale is far, far lower in their provision of 1 and 2 bedroom properties, and much more in their 3 and 4 bed. But the take from this slide is it's a very different setup in each town. So having a housing target that says we need to build X number is great, but unless we have something that says, and it's this size and this type and this tenure at this price in these towns, then we're not meeting the needs of local people. And that's what the work is that we've been doing. And as I say, if I had an hour to share with you, I'd share the data, and I'm sure that things will be shared with you in due course. What's really interesting to see is when we've got smaller accommodation, and we've got a significant amount of smaller accommodation in Ealing, and that's because of development sites and the availability of land and all the other things that go with that. We also have levels of overcrowding, and the graph on the right hand side shows you that. Now, there are some towns that have higher levels of overcrowding than others, some quite significantly. We absolutely see a correlation of high levels of ethnic diversity in some of those towns, perhaps less so in Perivale, but in Greenford, Northolt and Southall we do. So there's absolutely a need to put higher, larger properties in those areas. Thank you. Next slide. So that is the last slide I'm going to share data. There's a lot to take in there, and we've hundreds of those slides, and we've issued those to your officers today. Again, I'm not going to run through all these towns, but I just wanted to share with you some of the things and the data we've been sharing with your officers to how you turn your local plan policies and numbers into what needs to happen in local towns. So if we take Acton and Ealing, which have a similarity, we can tell your officers around where we've got population growth, where we've got younger families or young professionals, where we've got those pockets of deprivation, where we've got more older people than perhaps otherwise, therefore we need to think about that offer, where we've got lower incomes and less affordable housing, and therefore the need to give intermediate housing more so over social housing, because one of the things we've looked at is where social housing is plotted in the borough. So there's some locations where you've got social housing in excess of 25, 28%. That's incredibly high. The national average is about 20. And whilst we will always need more social housing. Of course we will. That waiting list never disappears, does it? But we also need to think about other cohorts, so that sort of squeezed middle who will never get into social housing, but will never be able to afford home ownership, who have very limited choices in the private rented sector. For those households, we need to think about more intermediate products, so we can pinpoint with your officers where those need to be. Next slide, just to show you, I've actually looked at the different towns, and within that, we've set out exactly what those towns need. And as I say, not going to go through it. Next slide. We've talked about the final town, which is Southall. So we've been able to give your officers the updated information, the real understanding of what those towns look like, and therefore what type of accommodation, what size, what type, what tenure, what price they need to be putting in place. And we've linked that back to your draft local plan, which is very clear where the areas of opportunity are. It's very clear where the promotion of residential development is. And therefore, there's an absolute alignment between what our evidence is saying is what that plan's saying. And then what you'll see is James and Maggie start to put the housing strategy together, is a link around what goes into the strategy and what we're going to be suggesting as priorities. I'm going to hand over to Mike now. Happy to take questions after of this, but Mike will take you into the real detail, because whilst I talk about the towns, Mike's going to take you down into, well, what size and what type of accommodation we need and how does the evidence show that. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Helen, and good evening, everybody. If we could move on to the next slide. What I want to do is start off with what the 2022 local housing need assessment was saying, and then show you how I've then taken that a lot further, brought the evidence base up to date to give you that granular insight into what is needed at the town level across Ealing. So for starters, the 2022 assessment identified an affordable housing need, which was illustrated earlier in Sam's presentation, which is saying there needs to be a 70-30 split between social and affordable rented and an intermediate stroke affordable home ownership, which is entirely consistent with the London Plan Policy H6, which is emphasising a broad split, but for Ealing, what we're saying is that split needs to be particularly emphasised towards social and affordable rented. So we're consistent with what the LHNA was saying. Moving to the next slide. What I've done is started with the LHNA and looked at the splits in terms of number of bedrooms that are identified in that document, but then also compared that with the latest housing register. And the pattern is broadly consistent. I think what the housing register is saying perhaps is slightly higher numbers of larger dwellings that are needed. But overall, there is some consistency, although time has moved on, there's a little bit of consistency in terms of what the housing register is saying, which is actually very helpful, because what I've then done is taken that housing register and looked at the variations in need at the town level. So moving on. So taking the housing register, what I've looked at is the range of dwellings that are needed by people on that register by where they are currently located. Now, obviously, people may choose to move to different localities within Ealing, but that gets the data then gets way too complex. What I'm trying to do here is understand for people where they are at the moment, and if they were to be accommodated locally, which would make sense because it links in with people's friendship, family networks, etc. What we've done here is looked at, assuming all of that, this is the kind of split that we're looking for in terms of social stroke affordable rented housing by each of the towns. So this is starting to give some very helpful granular insights based on the local, based on the most recent local data as to what's going on. So if we move on, one of the things that we do need to look at is intermediate. That's things like London Living Rent, but also affordable home ownership and the different products that are associated with that, such as shared ownership, shared equity, and first homes. Now, we don't have any housing register data on that particular type of affordable housing, but what we do have is data from the local housing need assessment, which gave some reasonable estimates as to what was required for this type of affordable tenure. We also have our own estimates based on national data, which tends to skew particularly towards the 2 and the 3 bed. But what the evidence for Ealing is saying is that really there's a particular need for 1, 2 and 3 bed affordable home ownership products, with some degree of need for 4 bed as well. So now what I've not been able to do is identify any data at a sub area level, because it simply does not exist. But what we're able to do is use that as a starting point for understanding what needs to be delivered at the sub area level across Ealing. So moving on, please. What I've also looked at, so that's affordable, but it's really important that we have to consider the broader range of needs to cover other groups as well. And what I've done is some additional work looking at the underlying demographics of Ealing and how they are expected to change over the period to 2040. What I've then done is looked at the relationship between dwellings occupied and the households that live in them by age group and type. Now, what we've done nationally, we do a lot of household survey work. And what we've been able to do from that survey work is understand the relationship between dwellings and households, which does include survey work we've done in London boroughs as well. So what this helps us to do is understand the overall demand for housing. And from that, we can then start to look at how that may well vary at the town level. So what we're able to do was look at the 2021. So again, using the 2021 census, which is obviously one of the most up-to-date sources you can get and one of the nationally consistent sources, what we've been able to do is look at the household types in each of the towns and link that to our national data. And in so doing, understand where there are particular nuances in particular towns, what that means in terms of the dwelling types and sizes that are going to be required there. So if we move on to look at what this data actually starts to look like, what we're saying is that, so this summary table sets out what we believe is an appropriate mix by market, social stroke affordable rented, and intermediate stroke affordable home ownership across Ealing, and then also what the overall range should be. Now, one thing that I do want to note, what I need you to note, is that the actual market mix that we're suggesting is broader than the market mix suggested in the local housing needs assessment. That was particularly skewed towards the delivery of 3-bedroom properties. What we're finding from the demographic analysis is probably a broader range of housing that is needed, but still focusing on the larger products, on the larger 3 and 4 bed. What we also note from the analysis is that for affordable rented, really the majority of need is going to be for 1, 2 or 3 bed, and there is still some need for larger 4 bed social stroke affordable. For affordable home ownership, we're recommending those splits there. Again, quite a broad range, again focusing on the 1 to 3 bed, and then overall particular focus on 2 and 3 bed. So that sets the scene for Ealing Borough. Now, one thing that I did want to reference, and working in London, it's more difficult than working in other areas, because very often we do this analysis and we break it down to dwelling types as well as size. It's more tricky in London because of the complexities of delivery and the need for high density. So we don't do that. But what I have done is included something on level access, because one of the things that we are finding from our national studies is that there is an increasing need to anchor into any development level access accommodation. Now, in the context of lower density areas, you can be talking about bungalows, but obviously in London, that's much more of a challenge. So we're thinking here about appropriate multi-level flats that have got proper access that allows people that have mobility issues to actually use dwellings on different levels. The key point here is that what people are saying to us is that they want everything all on one level when they're using their homes. So it is really important that we start to anchor that into strategic thinking. So if we move on to the next slide, which really sets out more detail for you. Sorry to say, more stats, but more detail. And what this is doing is building on what I talked about, understanding the overall future demographics, looking at the demographics of individual towns, looking at the specific needs for affordable stroke social rent and the other 10 years. What we come to as a final conclusion on what is going to be appropriate in terms of development mix by different tenures for the different towns. There are some degrees of variance which are linked back to the structures of households living in each of the areas, but there isn't a massive difference. So really the important thing though is that when development is taking place, you are much better equipped as a local authority to determine whether schemes coming forward actually reflect the underlying needs on the ground of communities and households. That is the big thing that I want to get across tonight, that the work we've done is really trying to help you make those more informed strategic decisions. And we've spent the time to look at the evidence in a granular way to give you this very clear statement as to what is actually required on a town by town basis. And if we move on, I believe that's the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, if there's any questions, we're more than happy to take them. And
Indeed.
Maggie and James McHugh also are here in terms of the housing strategy work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Block and his team. Councillor Martin, please.
It's a very interesting presentation, but I just wanted to clarify that I understood it fully. So, for example, I'm a councillor for Northolt. Probably the most common thing that comes to our surgeries is overcrowding, or perceived overcrowding. The figures that you've looked at, have you looked at actual household sizes, or just the number of rooms that people currently have? That was the bit I wasn't totally clear about.
Yeah, it's the actual for the national data that we use. We look at the relationship between households and the dwellings that they are in. So there is that broad correlation. When it comes to the evidence in particular around housing need, what we've been ensuring is that we're looking at the actual needs of the families that are on the housing register, because obviously they're going to be in the most acute need in terms of accommodation provision. So when we've looked at the evidence there, it's been very clearly anchored to the actual number of bedrooms that people will need.
Councillor Disco.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just trying to grapple with the practical application of all of this. So we can take all this evidence and all the stats and data, and then we apply it to our policies. So if you're saying, if you are coming forward with a larger development of X size, then you must have this spread of accommodation. So X number of 1, 2, 3 bedroom properties, if it's a large, is that what we're driving to here? So that was my first point. I mean, the other thing is about that shift in the demographics of the borough. We can see it materializing very immediately in primary schools with reduced roles. We saw it on the Appendix A with the reducing size of households. But I'm just sort of grappling with how fitting all this into like a mathematical model and sort of casting this amongst all the different towns that we can comfortably predict that we know what is needed, when I think people might live in one town but might want to go not too far afield but to a neighboring town because the mix of shops, a mix of amenities, but they don't think that is detrimental, but they don't always want to stay in that town, but they want that flexibility. Are we being a bit too tight with the stats and the figures?
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, just in terms of how you apply the information, I think the main thing I'm wanting from the work that myself and Helen do for local authorities is to give councils a much better informed approach to strategic decision making. That's what I'm wanting to achieve, or that's what we're wanting to achieve. And as part of that, if you've got much better information around the dwelling mixes that are going to be appropriate for different areas. That is going to help you when developers come forward with options for development. So if it's skewed, let's say, towards 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings, you can say, well, actually, no, we've got a much broader need that's going on. And to be frank, one of the big problems I've experienced working in London is the proportions of smaller dwellings that have been built, which are only exacerbating the overcrowding situation. So part of my objective here is to try and rebalance that and make sure there's a much broader spread of dwellings that get built within London generally, and also Ealing specifically. So that's one thing. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we're giving a broad picture, and the picture is based on individuals, on their choices, on their preferences, on their experiences. And we are dealing with individuals at the end of the day who will make their own choices. So what I would suggest is that you look at the evidence as a broad picture as to the general trajectory around what should be being built, but recognizing within that people will still make individual choices. The interesting thing is that when I've looked at the town level analysis, as I say, there are some degrees of difference in terms of the appropriate dwelling mixes by town, but they're not massively significantly different. So there's a reasonableness in developing a broad range of housing linked to the evidence that we have got, which is really ultimately going to be helping you make sure there's a much diverse range of provision coming forward.
Could I just add something? So it's Maggie Rafalovich. And I think in the way that actually this feeds into the housing strategy, I think one of the things is that different parts of Ealing have different requirements. And therefore, I mean, you can't actually necessarily force a developer to do. They'll come to you, they'll come with their viability studies, they'll say what they can and can't do. But I think as a local authority, if you have a vision and objectives about what you want to see or what you think is required in different towns, and you can base that on some evidence to say this is what you want, and you can work towards it and aim towards it, taking into account all the demographic changes, etc.
Thank you, Maggie. Councillor Vaughan.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation. There was quite a lot of information we blinked at, I think, as it went past us. You talk about broader spread. I mean, you build and they will come as a sort of in some respects, but the infrastructure around Crossrail and HS2 and hospitals and shops and whatever, is that thrown into the mix? And the second thing is, when I say you build it, they will come. I mean, we should be fluid in what we really want for, and not just towns, but cross towns and part towns. I mean, for instance, Northfields, it's not identified as a town, but it is a unique area in itself, and Southfields, for want of a better term. But there are miniature towns within towns, and it's not. I don't know. I don't know where I'm really going with this, but I think it's kind of not one size fits all here. And the danger is we are trying to make it one size fits all. We're just taking what's there now and saying that's what it'll be forevermore. And I wouldn't like to go down that approach, really, that nothing can change and nothing can be, we only want 2-3 bedrooms there, and we only want 1 bedrooms here. It's not what I would see as a future borough. It's dynamic, it changes all the time. And we've changed certainly a lot in the last 10, 20 years.
Dr. Michael?
I think one of the important things to recognise is that as a local authority, there is that responsibility to look after who you've got now and understand what their particular needs are. So I take the point of what you're talking about, but I do think there is an importance of understanding who is in your borough now and how the people in your borough are likely to change over a reasonable period of time. We're looking at, we've projected information up to 2040. This is where it gets interesting for yourselves as well to be making those strategic decisions around, are you looking to encourage different groups into the area, linking with Crossrail, for instance? Are you looking to develop new markets within Ealing? I mean, really, I'll probably bring Helen in here just to talk a little bit more around some of the strategic side of it, because you're right. What we're basing is evidence on what we know now and how that is likely to change in the future. But you can change that future as a local authority and as strategic thinkers. So I'll bring Helen in just to see if she can give you a little bit more insight into how you can start with this data, but then how you can then start to use it to think around how you want to change the characteristics or the nature of dwelling stock. I don't know, Helen, have you got any further comments to make?
Thanks, Mike. Just making sure I'm still awake. Well done. No, Mike's absolutely right. So we can only give you. So let's just start with, if you build it, they will come. Absolutely. No, there's this huge demand. Of course they will. But what you're trying to create are balanced communities that also, as Mike says, meets the need of people who are living there. And it's not just their need now, it's their need as they move through their housing life cycle. It's their need as they move from this age to that age with children, without upsize, downsize. And it's about having people having the best possible housing offer that they can have. So just because developers may want to build this here, we need to have an evidence base that helps us negotiate those planning arrangements whereby we say, well, actually, okay, this is what our evidence tells us we need. Now, look, I know lots of developers are going to say, well, don't care about that, I'm doing this. And if you're not passing your housing delivery test, it's going to be really hard for you. But when you present developers with a very hard core evidence base, a granular evidence that says, this is what we know we need here, this is what you'll sell here, this is what will rent better here, you have a much stronger argument to do that. And everything we talk about at the moment is policy off. So that means it's going to happen no matter what, unless you do something about it, unless you try to change things. So, for example, in Ealing, when I showed you the maps before, we've got a real gentrification going on. We have absolutely got those people with money coming in and those people without possibly being forced out, I am sure. And if they're not forced out, they're living in not great circumstances. So as an authority, you could absolutely decide that you want to throw your weight and your money and your interventions to deliver more social housing there, more intermediate products there, so you can start to try and give different opportunities for people who may not live there now because they can't, but would like to live there. So we're not just feeding those people with the income, but we're giving choice. So I think our evidence base, as Mike says, allows you to just have a much more finessed view of what you're going to fight for, what you're going to stand behind, what your ambition in your housing strategy is going to be. Of course, the reflection into what happens at planning stage is very different, but it allows you to have a much stronger evidence base of what's needed. And in our experience, that's hugely useful when taking those sort of schemes forward.
Thank you, Helen, but Councillor Wall wants just to follow it up.
Yeah, you're quite right about what I call almost enshrining middle class ghettos, and that map earlier shows Ealing as almost a donut effect, from the middle outwards, or dartboard, or whatever you want to call it. But the worrying thing from the stats that was the loss of young people at the younger end, and if we just kept things as they are, we'll continue to lose them. I mean, from me, the key thing that's come out is that we should now start thinking, how do we keep young people in this borough? I mean, it's probably not just this borough, it's probably the whole of London, to be quite honest. In the South East, it's very hard for younger people to be able to afford to live here, whether it's rent or buying. But that is a stat in itself that's showing projections that we're going to lose quite a healthy, well, not healthy, unhealthy percentage of young people from our borough, which will obviously manifest itself over time to 2060, 2080 of dropping the number of people in this borough. So we should be looking at that in terms of our strategy and where we'd like to encourage people and to potentially break middle class, upper class ghettos, for want of a better term. Apologies to anyone that's insulted by that. Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Ray. Sam, would you like to add something? You're raising your hand.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to briefly sort of relate this back to how it would be implemented through the local plan and how housing will be delivered. I mean, obviously, the evidence that has been presented is evidence of need, and effectively, that will be it will be plugged into the most up-to-date evidence will be plugged into the local plan policies, which still set out the same degree of delivery according to specific sizes and specific tenures to best meet need as we understand it at that point. I think the point's also been raised a number of times about the practicality of delivering housing, and it's probably worth saying that will be picked up in the next report in item 3. So maybe we'll cycle back to that if it suits councillors. Maybe we should come back to that at the panel session at the end or in questions subsequent to the third report.
Thank you, Sam. Councillor Martin.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting report, and it raises a lot of questions, I think. But some of the things I've been thinking while we've been talking is, you know, certainly a few years ago, it was the case that people frequently moved, and that our populations locally, there was quite a lot of churn, and I don't know if that's been incorporated into what the research we've been doing, or indeed if we keep any records of that, if we keep any records of internal migration within the borough, and if we're aware if there are areas that are growing and some are shrinking because of, for example, housing cost issues. I mean, I'm sure it is a London trend, but population is just getting older. But equally, maybe this is a discussion for later, I don't know, is how are we fitting this information in with something like our 20-minute neighbourhood concept, where we might want to be bringing employment closer to home, and therefore that could impact on what sort of housing requirements we might want in the future. So I don't know if that's being built into this as well, or if that is indeed is something we need to do now.
A very interesting and thoughtful question. Yeah. Is anyone wanted to get input on that?
Yeah, if I may, we have absolutely thought about, so we look at the draft local plan and the commitment around 20-minute neighbourhoods, and we've drawn that into the evidence that we've looked at to consider where and how housing aligns with that. Of course, it doesn't define the 20-minute neighbourhoods, but yeah, in terms of housing, we have considered that.
Right. Thank you, Councillor Ball.
Yes, thanks. So two questions. Firstly, really, following on from Councillor Martin's point, really, affordable housing, people who live in affordable housing are relatively static because you need a local connection to get allocated. But in private rented or owner-occupied houses, I mean, certainly my experience is most people who move in, they're moving from out of borough. And also many people move out either because they want to move further from London to get more space, or because they just simply can't afford to rent in Ealing anymore and they have to move somewhere cheaper. So isn't it slightly artificial to look at the Ealing housing market as if it's an island when you go outside of affordable? As I think it's different for affordable. Beyond affordable, I just think it's a sort of, yeah. The other thing I found very interesting in the presentation was what you're saying in terms of unit sizes, because essentially that the unit sizes in each town vary, but not massively in terms of the requirement. Because what we often hear from residents and from councillors for particular wards is that in Southall we need lots and lots of 4-bedroom houses and so on. So there seems to be a conflict there between the the general perceived thinking of people in the borough and what you've found. So I don't know if you have any thoughts why that is. You know, certainly sort of what you were saying in terms of a requirement for, where is it, 25 to 30% affordable rented one bed. I mean, that's not what councillors would be from Southall or whatever would be saying was what people say they want in that area. You're actually saying there's a bigger need in Ealing for one beds than nationally. Whereas again, I think the kind of perception that comes from residents tends to be what we need is lots of large sized family units. Yeah. This is one of those interesting things between perceptions and reality. I mean, if you take Southall as an example, this is from your housing register of people who live there. The distribution of, basically 24% are looking for a one bed, 30% a two bed, 36% a three bed, and 10% a four bed. That is your people on the housing register now. That's what they're looking for, and it's the same for we've got that data for the other towns as well. So there is a reality check when you actually look at the empirical evidence as to what people are looking for. So you can look at your housing register. This is what it is telling you. That is not necessarily what people on the street are saying, but that is what is quite clear. On the general point as well you raise around Ealing as an island. Well, I totally agree. I mean, the housing market in London isn't just London; it extends right across southeast of England. When you look at commuting patterns, migration patterns, it's actually quite difficult sometimes to, certainly when you're working on some of the peripheral areas into Surrey and into Kent, there's really, really strong connections with London, which have a massive influence on how those particular markets operate. So it's really difficult to disentangle any particular location within London from that wider connectivity of Greater London itself. That said, you are a local authority area, you are therefore a local planning authority area, and so it's your responsibility to ensure that you have a local plan in place that seeks to meet the needs of your communities. So there is definitely the understanding that you are positioned within a much wider housing market context, but at the same time you've got a statutory responsibility to ensure that you're building appropriate accommodation within your specific borough to meet your specific needs. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there, but that is the reality of how we're operating when we're looking at housing and planning policy.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock, Helen, and Maggie. It's a very comprehensive study and research you are doing it in terms of housing strategy and giving us a direction. Thanks for your time. And
Thank you.
Have a lot of time, and we need to cover another presentation. So thank you once again for Dr. Bullock and your team.
Thank you so much.
Now, tonight we are just covering housing, so we have covered housing need and housing strategy. Now we need to cover the last bit, is housing delivery, which is more important than anything else. So can I just introduce our Principal Housing Officer, Ian Week, to tell us where we are in terms of housing delivery and in 5-year housing supply and potential implication for the council and local plan. Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me. Good evening, everybody. So in my presentation, as the Chair has said, I'm going to be dealing with the matters of housing supply and report back on two key measures in terms of how Ealing stands. So I'm going to provide a short update on our 5-year housing land supply position, and I'm also going to address how that supply position looks over, or how that supply position or projected delivery looks over a longer period of time via our housing trajectory. So as before I introduce the kind of function, method and findings for these outputs, I wanted to briefly acknowledge some of the steps that have taken us to get to this point. As most of you will be aware, it has been a number of years since we last formally published a 5-year housing land supply position and housing trajectory. I think we last did that as part of a previous AMR back in 2015, in fact. Although despite that gap, we have continued to track our supply position, although it's probably fair to say that this has been more reactive. For example, we've continued to update our 5-year housing land supply position in response to individual schemes and appeals, and we've been doing that up until 2019. Similarly, we've also maintained a trajectory internally until around 2020. I should also add as well that we've continued to track completions on an annual basis, and that's obviously to inform national reporting, like things like the housing delivery test. And a number of factors have affected our ability to publish a 5-year housing land supply and housing trajectory, and these are already well documented in some detail in the interim AMR and also in our housing supply position statement, which we issued last November. So I'm not going to go over that again here, but just say as a consequence of those issues that it's meant that we've struggled to access robust development monitoring data, and that is an essential ingredient behind these outputs. Council officers, though, have been working closely with GLA colleagues and also with our neighbouring boroughs to plug those data gaps and also address data quality issues as well. And we've also been reviewing processes and looking at tools to better maintain these data sets. So I suppose what I want to say is that the outputs that have been appended to the report, those represent snapshots in time. And it's important that this process is understood to be a live exercise. So, you know, and it changes with every permission given and each home built. And also that it's recognised that the process and outputs are iterative, and that there is scope for further refinement to improve the quality and accuracy of those outputs. So why do we need to identify a supply of housing sites? And I think in this context, when I talk about supply, we're really talking about the identification of sites capable of accommodating homes in the future, as distinct from homes already delivered. So the official line is that the identification of supply should help us to boost delivery through promoting individual sites for development. Obviously, whether it has that desired effects of boosting delivery is perhaps debatable, but nonetheless, this is seen as one of the key drivers. The identification of supply is also key in supporting the preparation of the local plan itself, and particularly in demonstrating that the local plan will be effective. And it does that through evidence in that the supply and projected delivery, which is planned and facilitated through the local plan, is likely to be adequate to satisfy our housing requirements or housing need, as has been covered in previous presentations. So in terms of demonstrating our position, the NPPF, or National Planning Policy Framework, tasks LPAs with identifying and maintaining a sufficient supply, a mix of sites capable of being delivered over the life of the local plan, and it requires us to organise supply around 2 key time periods, and these broadly correspond with the 2 outputs I'm going to talk about. So the first covers the years 1 to 5 of the plan, and the second relates to the latter years of the plan from years 6 to 15. So for years 1 to 5, our supply position is confirmed through our 5-year housing land supply position statements. And the methodology for calculating this is prescribed both in the NPPF and the planning practice guidance, which is that. So very simply, the process involves comparing the identified deliverable supply against the housing requirement for the next 5 years in order to determine if that supply is sufficient to meet or exceed the requirement. So the first step involves establishing our housing requirements, and that comprises a number of components. I suppose the most significant component is the basic requirement figure, and that is essentially the London Plan target, which is annualised and then multiplied by 5 for each of the years. And obviously then to this, we also add any shortfall arising from under delivery against the targets since the base date of the target period. And finally, we're also required to add a buffer, which is, so that's added on top, and that's calculated having regard, or the buffer we add, in fact, is calculated having regard to historical delivery performance as reported through the housing delivery test. So in terms of the supply side of the calculation, essentially this involves determining what supply and associated level of capacity is anticipated to be delivered over the next 5 years. It's necessary for us to prove that such capacity qualifies as being deliverable, as prescribed in the NPPF, and reflecting the inputs which inform the setting of the original targets as set out in the London Plan. This supply is made up of 3 components, and those are deliverable capacity from large sites, capacity assumed to be delivered or deliverable from small sites, and also on what's termed non-conventional capacity. So added together, these give us the projected supply, which can then be compared against the cumulative requirement figure, which I mentioned at step 1. Before I delve into the results, I want to kind of briefly talk about the methodology for the trajectory as well. And the trajectory itself utilises many of the same data sets as the 5-year housing land supply position statement as well, but there are some key differences as well. The most significant of which is that the trajectory examines supply, or I suppose, or to put it another way, projected delivery over the duration of the local plan. So the trajectory examines a 19-year window, so of which 15 years look into the future. So the trajectory utilises the same base year as employed for the 5-year housing land supply, and accounts for historical delivery since the 1st of April 2019. So for years 1 to 5 of the trajectory, it utilises the same requirements and supply inputs as for the 5-year housing land supply, again, which need to satisfy the definition of deliverable, although it doesn't add a buffer. So although operational only until 2029, the annualised London Plan targets are rolled forward from year 7 through to year 15 of the trajectory. And the identified supply inputs for years 6 to 15, those are required to satisfy, I suppose, a somewhat looser definition of developable as distinct from deliverable. So a range of methods have been employed to determine the associated capacity yields for individual supply inputs and sites. And then these capacity numbers are then assigned or plotted against future years based on the anticipated timing of delivery. So having now completed both exercises, we can share some of the headline results with you. I did want to mention as well that within the presentation here, I've not been able to embed the trajectory in full because it's made up of a large spreadsheet with multiple tabs. But I have been able to extract some of the key kind of headline outputs from that. So in respect to the 5-year housing land supply calculation, the cumulative requirement is 16,650 net additional units. And as published in the original papers, the total supply identified amounts to 11,721. So obviously that represents a shortfall of just under 5,000 units in absolute terms. So, and in percentage terms, our supply equates to 70% of the requirement total, or if measured in years, that equates to around 3.5 years of supply. And anything short of 5 years means that we fail against the NPPF tests, but the extent of the shortfall is also significant. And where we're unable to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply position, the NPPF presumption in favour of sustainable development is engaged, which is also known as the tilted balance, and Councillor Manroe kind of briefly talked about that earlier. Just to say that the consequence of that tilted balance is that renders the authorities' housing supply policies out of date and requires permission to be granted, except in cases where the adverse impacts of doing so would significantly or demonstrably outweigh the benefits. In reality, the impact is a bit more nuanced than that, and obviously that I can explain that in a bit more detail, but conscious of the time, I will kind of move on. As one thing I wanted to mention as well, which you'll see in this table, that there are a number of inputs in the table, which are highlighted in yellow. And these are updated figures, which we only captured yesterday. And those reflect the identification of a further 1,016 completed units within the 2022-23 year. And so that increases our reported completion figure for that year to 1,858. So now we've updating the 22-23 completion figures to account for the newly identified completions. That reduces our historical shortfall down to around 2,074. And based on the housing delivery test results, we're still required. So our performance against that now is at 81%, but nonetheless that's still below the 85% threshold, which determines whether or not a 20% buffer needs to be applied. So we are still required to apply a 20% buffer, albeit it's on a it's calculated on a smaller amount. So obviously that's reduced in a smaller buffer figure of 2,572. Despite this update, deliverable supply still falls short to the requirement. So it represents now around 3.8 years of supply. But I think what this latest update illustrates is very much the live status of these outputs. And obviously I want to return to that. I also want to return to what the ongoing steps are that we're taking to try and improve the data quality and to maintain these outputs going forward. Move on. So turning then to the trajectory, and this allows us to examine supply over the full life of the plan and also at various intervals throughout the period. And I suppose I wanted to start by noting that although we've, as I think I've mentioned, although we've not been able to embed the full trajectory into the presentation, obviously we have been able to kind of extract some of the headline data here. There is a loss of detail in this table, and I'm not expecting anyone to be able to kind of discern or kind of digest it here now. But I do want to kind of highlight a few things. So the table captures details for each of the 19 years covered by the trajectory. There are 4 past years and 15 future years. So obviously the 4 historical years, those are in red to orange. And the future years those are split into 3 5-year intervals, and those are highlighted in green. So the blue rows, those deal with, those show the requirement figures both as a single yearly target and also as a cumulative target. And the green rows capture completions figures, both actual and projected, and the kind of buff colour, salmon colour rows, those essentially detail the variance comparing completions against the target. And they also present a rolling requirement balance adjusted to account for the completions. So from the previous table, it's possible for us to tease out a number of findings. So when examined across the full plan period, the results show that the completions will outstrip the cumulative requirement figure by 6,126 units. So whilst this predicted surplus isn't excessive when measured over 19 years, it nonetheless demonstrates that there is still some contingency nonetheless exists. And obviously this longer term result contrasts with the 5-year house and land supply position, which you'll recall showed that completions were predicted to fall short of the requirement during the first third of the plan period. So in this chart and the one that follows this one, these better illustrate the variation in performance over the full plan period. So the blue line, this denotes or represents the actual target. And this shows the annual delivery, both actual and predicted, is expected to fall short of the annual target until at least 2024-25. And this lack of capacity from completions and the approval pipeline during the initial period of the trajectory is compensated during the future years from years kind of 3 to 11 really onwards. And that's through an increased level of capacity identified from the allocations. So capacity falls below the target again from around year 11, and that's not kind of untypical for trajectories of this type, and is probably largely indicative of the fact that we lack information, or there's a lack of information held in relation to individual sites, rather than it actually being representative of any kind of long-term trends. In addition, it's actually quite challenging for us to try and comprehensively identify which sites might be available or suitable that far into the future as well. So in this chart presents the findings as a cumulative measure, and whilst the previous chart shows that annual completions are projected to start to exceed the target from 2025-26 onwards, given the shortfall that's been accrued between 2019 and 2024, taken as a cumulative measure, the shortfall between completions of requirements is only closed in 2028 and 29. The timing of this point in 2029 to 2028-29 is significant though, as it corresponds with the end date of the London Plan target period. And although that target has been annualised for the purpose of this exercise, it is in fact expressed as a single 10-year figure. And so it is reasonable and possible to conclude then that based on the current supply inputs, Ealing is predicted to satisfy the London Plan target before the end of that target period. And post 2028-29, we are predicted to comfortably exceed the requirements, and this is expected to continue beyond the plan period itself. And just briefly on this one, this chart shows the makeup of the projected supply inputs. And again, it's kind of helpful to illustrate how that makeup changes over the plan period. And I suppose it very much resembles what we would expect to see, with the initial period largely being made up of existing approvals represented in orange in the chart. And the supply of this source will diminish over time. And then as those permissions are built out, as is evident though, this is compensated by an increase in supply from allocations, not currently benefiting from permission, which is represented in green, and then later on by large site win for capacity, which is kind of represented in brown. I'm almost getting there, apologies. It's also useful to consider the geographical spread of the projected capacity, and this table shows that split by each of the 7 towns. There's probably are no real surprises here. So based on identified supply sources, Southall, Acton and Ealing are still projected to absorb the biggest share at around 73% of the projected supply. Although I would say that Southall in particular has a large existing pipeline of approvals. And I think that partly explains why the numbers are so high for that town. As I mentioned at various points during my presentation, the 5-year housing land supply position statements and the housing trajectory, which I've referenced today, those represent a snapshot in time. And obviously has to be recognised that these findings will change with every permission given and each home built. And also whilst the process of preparing a 5-year housing land supply statements and housing trajectory is not an exact science and it relies heavily on professional judgment, there nonetheless is significant potential for us to improve aspects of the exercise and to address data quality, and in doing so improve the robustness and accuracy of future trajectories and 5-year housing land supplies outputs. And obviously that will increase the confidence we're able to attach to them going forward. And so it's working towards this goal. So work towards this goal is ongoing. I'm going to briefly mention a couple of things that we're doing. So following the transition from what was called the Local Development Days to the Planning London Data Hub, sorry, we've been continuing to work closely with GLA colleagues and neighbouring boroughs as part of a task force with a remit of reviewing processes. And this has resulted in a number of outcomes and recommended changes. This has included the introduction of new periodic data checks, which are intended to identify and close gaps in the database. The GLA are also planning to shortly launch a new portal interface, and that will allow the boroughs to access and edit the data directly, which is something we're not able to do at present. So that will both improve our understanding around the data, but also improve the efficiency in which we're able to access and update the records. And the GLA will also be releasing new reporting tools, which will give boroughs much more control over how we can export and analyse the data. And we're also expecting to undertake further upgrades to our own back office system. And that will, again, allow us to improve the movement of data between the systems. Also, the next Regulation 19 consultation stage on the local plan, this will also provide another opportunities for us to verify and validate site-specific inputs and assumptions, which we've included in the position statements and the trajectory. So obviously, this gives us another opportunity to improve our understanding around individual sites, what they could do, the readiness of landowners bringing those sites forward, and so on as well. It's also important that we continue to take account of any external factors, as these, as we're aware that obviously there may well be changes in relation to the requirement targets. There may well be changes in relation to national policy requirements, and there also may well be changes arising as a result of performance measures such as the housing delivery test. So as I say, obviously the aim is to continue to maintain and update the 5-year housing land supply position statement and the trajectory. And obviously, it is our intention to publish a further version before we submit the plan. Obviously, if any of the actions I've mentioned trigger any significant changes, particularly change any of the consequences that I've mentioned, such as things like the tilted balance, then obviously we would look to publish something sooner. And I think that about wraps it up for me. Thank you. Apologies for running over.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Discrow.
That was quite a roller coaster. And it was a bit of sort of, in all meanings of roller coaster, but the amount of volume of data. But all of a sudden we're told that it looks like we're not going to meet the target. And then we're told we are going to meet the target over 10 years. And then to add on to that, it's not about us meeting the target physically building, because we do the approvals by and large and some building, but not enough to be substantial for most of that build. We can do the approvals, but we don't do the completions. That's down. So it's like walking on quicksand, I think. And then at what point does a developer say, I've got a scheme that's quite bold, not egregious, but bold, and play a trump card, or you're not meeting your target, tilted balance, you should approve it because this will help you to meet your targets. At what point in that cycle could a developer do that, or how does that happen or not happen? I mean, there's just so many imponderables, plus a lot of this is projecting into the future, almost crystal ball looking in for many a time. So where does this all go, basically?
Yeah, Councillor Munro.
So at what point? We've already reached that point, because we had the Manor Road one where we couldn't provide the evidence, and the tilted balance was one of the things. But now that we've clearly outlined it, it could happen tomorrow. It could happen to any scheme that's in our pipeline. If we were to say no, or we were minded not to accept that scheme, they could go to appeal, and they could then use the tilted balance and say, your local plan doesn't show that you can provide the supply. We want to build this scheme out. Please let us. And the government inspector would say, yes, go ahead. And that's happening throughout the country. It's happening in many, many local authorities where they've refused, and costs are then passed on also if that happens, because an inspector just says, you've not reached your target. Why won't you let them build? There are some special circumstances where the application is so outrageous and causes so many problems, but that's not normally the case. It's normally the case that we don't really want to see that sort of development in that area, but because we're not producing enough or not getting enough built by other developers, the inspector says, let them build, and they're given permission to build by the inspector. So it'll happen from, well, it's already happened, but it's from today.
Thank you, Councillor Monroe. Councillor Wall and Councillor Ball.
So the question is, when will the balance tilt in our favour? At what point along this trajectory will we get there? Because does it need to be when we've gone past that that bar that you set earlier in one of the many slides we've seen this evening? And apologies, you did get the graveyard shift, and you are going to get and well done, by the way. But we have seen a lot of information tonight, so I'm just conscious of asking the questions of when are we going to be able to be a borough that says we don't want that for reason, and we don't get tilted balance thrown at us.
So there are two, and Councillor Monroe's kind of touched on this already. There's two mechanisms by which the tilted balance can be triggered, and the first obviously is in relation to performance against the housing delivery test, and currently there are different percentage level. So there are different percentage performance levels basically. If you fall below 75% of your, so the way the housing delivery test, what the housing delivery test looks at is your your cumulative delivery for the past 3 years against your cumulative requirement for the past 3 years, and so any shortfall. So if it falls below 75%, then currently that triggers a the presumption in favour of sustainable trends, or the tilted balance. The other way in which it's triggered is where we're not able to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, and obviously that will remain the case until we are able to identify sufficient deliverable supply, and that's i.e. sufficient supply to meet our cumulative needs for the first 5 years, or for the next 5 years basically, and we're required to continue to roll that forward and update that that position. There's been some debate about whether or not housing delivery tests will survive in the long term, and so it is possible, for example, that trigger or that ability, that trigger might fall away. I mean, currently with the inclusion of those additional completions I mentioned in 2022-23, which took us up to around 1,800 for that year, that's meant we've increased our delivery up to 81%. So currently under the housing delivery test, that's not triggering the tilted balance, but the position around the 5-year housing land supply is. I suppose the other thing to mention as well is under the current kind of national policy framework, we are required to produce and publish a 5-year housing land supply annually and to maintain that position. As proposed under revisions to the NPBF, there will only be a requirement to do it once, and that will be effectively on adoption of the plan, so effectively as part of the evidence base. However, so that we're required to do it once, and that will remain current and operational for a period of 5 years. So and so once the plan is older than 5 years, or reach its 5th anniversary, then we would then have to produce annual 5-year housing land supply. So if before submission we can find sufficient supply, then we avoid that being an issue. Unless delivery falls off, then that may well bring it back into an issue again. So apologies if that's quite a long rambling answer.
Possible.
Yeah. So the planning assumptions, phasing assumptions on pages 314 to 317. So they seem to, if I'm understanding it right, they seem to assume that all allocated sites will be built on eventually and all sites with full permission within 7 years. And surely the reality is that many of the permissions that have been granted won't be built. So it kind of feels like there ought to be a kind of a percentage in there. And I mean, I realise it'll be offset to some extent by schemes coming out of the blue. So things that are counted as windfall coming earlier than that. So it's not all in one direction. But then you showed the graph that in 2028 it will all come good. But isn't that a result of that assumption? If we're assuming that everything with permission that'll happen within 7 years, then you're bound to have a point where it all comes good on the graph.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. I think in terms of the assumptions, they're based on the information that we hold at present around individual sites, and as we understand more, as time passes and we understand more about those sites, we'd expect the distribution of that supply to even out. So at the moment it is very lumpy in that kind of middle five-year period. But as I say, we expect that to even out as time moves forward. What I would say is, the point you made about whether or not we need to account for the likely probability of these sites coming forward, and that is a practice that, for example, happens in relation to the SHLA. In the case of the inputs that have informed the trajectory, however, all of the inputs have been tested in relation to deliverability. So we've gone through an exercise of, and it's quite a sort of extensive exercise, and we expect to be scrutinised on this particular point at examination. So we've gone through a process of demonstrating that these sites are achievable, they're available, and that involves contacting all landowners and other interested parties to understand their kind of appetite to bring these sites forward. So in that sense, I think we are confident that all of those sites, could come forward during the plan period. The other thing I'd mention as well is that in terms of estimating capacity for or capacity yield for individual sites, we have taken a fairly kind of conservative kind of position on this, in that, and again, this is because we expect to be tested and scrutinised on our calculations as part of the examination process. And so I think we want to be confident that that these sites could at a very minimum yield these sorts of numbers. Obviously what we're not able to do, because it's a fairly high level exercise, is we're not able to account for the sorts of kind of detailed design considerations that you would do when an application is in our desks to assess, basically. So as I say, for that reason we've adopted fairly conservative capacity yields. So even if some of those sites were to fall by the wayside, I think that would be compensated by additional capacity on other sites that remain to be delivered.
Thank you, Ian, and I'm sure it will be compensated by the target here. So can I take the two questions together, Councillor Martin, you and
Yeah, mine's a quick one, I think.
yeah.
So
Sure, and Councillor Disco.
When we were looking at sites, well, all those sites we put into the local plan as possible sites, are these the ones we're talking about for these projections?
Shall I come back on that
If
one?
so, is that all of the sites that we put into the plan? Or?
So there were 118 sites that we went out to consultation on Reg 18. Being blunt, there were quite a few kites being flown at that stage, because whilst we might, as officers, thought they were very promising, we obviously needed buy-in from landowners, from other agencies to prove deliverability. So some of those sites have fallen by the wayside because we can't do that. Doesn't mean that we won't necessarily be trying to pump, prime and bring those forward and bring landowners together and do land assembly, etc. But we also then got some other sites which were suggested by landowners as part of the call for sites process. So there were some additional sites that came back in. The net impact is, and again, it's subject to member level sign off because we're preparing the draft proposals for you to scrutinise in detail. At the moment, we have 85 sites on the shortlist for inclusion in the local plan. Okay, so that gives you an idea of where we got to. So, you know, confidence that Ian is expressing there is very much around the very considerable and robust work we've done around that. And again, emphasising the fact policy planners always tend to be very conservative in our estimate around housing capacity. And if you see figures that we perhaps put in historical trajectories, and you see the schemes that then come before planning committee, for example, usually the number is much higher. And that's because obviously far more work is done to be able to mitigate site constraints, etc. Policy planners tend to over-egg some of those impacts, perhaps. So that's why, you know, we're quite assured that the concern that Councillor Ball quite rightly raises, that will be netted off as part of that sort of process.
Thank you, Steve. The last question I will take from Paul Discord, Councillor Discord, and the last question from Mr. Will French. So, and we will finish the meeting. We are already pressing time. So
just trying
Councillor
to
Discord.
thread this trajectory and the local plan together. So if we've got this requirement, as long as we're going over 75%, if I'm remembering correctly, 75% of the target build, as long as we're over that, we're defensible against the tilt. And disagree with if I got this wrong, because that's why I'm asking the question. You know, if we do that for 3 years, then we're defensible. But also having identifiable sites in the local plan is another thread of defence. Did I understand that correctly, or clarify, please?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's you're spot on. So there's two ways in which it can be triggered. One is performance in case of delivery, as you say, providing we're above 75%, we avoid the presumption being triggered. And again, providing we can identify sufficient supply of sites, deliverable sites for the first 5 years or next 5 years, then again, we avoid the presumption being triggered.
I just want to confirm that we're only identified 3.8 years at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Manro, and thank you for your reply, Ian. Now, we are really running out of time, so I will ask Mr. Will French come on that table and ask question, please. And that will be the last.
Oh, there we are. Thank you. Lots of questions, really, because we've seen a lot of information. But I think the point I want to just make is that we're looking at 47,000 new homes, I think, or thereabouts in the next 15 years, I think, which if we're looking at what that means, the population growth will be around about 100,000 extra people in the borough, as my calculations. And I think what I would like, Councillor, you to understand is to reflect a bit on the concern this has for a lot of people in the borough about the strain that this is going to put on existing social infrastructure, what extra demands it's going to make on all sorts of things, including transport provision, including schools and health services, and also the impacts of such a large amount of development on the environment, and I'm meaning both the natural environment. We're hearing, of course, previously about some open land being taken for development, I believe, and also on the historic environment and what this extra development is going to be. So I would like to ask you just to reflect on that. And I would also ask you, in the context of that, what are we going to do with the new London plan. The London plan is coming up for review. So far, Mr. Week was saying we're just simply projecting forward the 2,100 homes per annum, which we've had up to now. And my question is it really reasonable to think we can sustain that level of development over the next 15 years, considering all the impacts that we've already had from the amount of development that there's been in the past 10 years? So that's my question, really. It's about what we're going to say to the mayor and to the London plan when they come to review it. I would like to suggest we make a case, actually, we should scale back because we can't continue to absorb the rate of development that the borough has been experiencing up to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. French, for your concern and raising that issue. Councillor Munro will, could you please come forward and ask the question, and we will cover both, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll keep it short, but it's been very interesting to hear some really interesting presentations this evening. I'm very surprised that this information was not presented earlier so that it could have been included in the Reg 18 proposal of the local plan. But what really worries me is that the comment by Chital Munro earlier has presented an extremely worrying scenario. We have failed to deliver the actual units for which planning permission has been given over a number of times in recent years. That means that the gap between supply and demand has been increasing. We're now looking at a scenario where developers are able to get planning permission without the compulsion of delivering those units that they've got planning permission for. And that puts other sites in future under even greater pressure because developers can say that we failed to meet the demands of the target, and therefore they can be given more planning permission for more sites without any compulsion or pressure by the council to ensure that developers actually meet the targets that they've been given permission for. We are at the mercy of every developer that comes along. And this is extremely worrying for the nature of housing and for the types of housing and the affordability of housing that we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you for raising that question. Councillor Munro and Steve.
So I think people misunderstand the level of development that's occurred in the borough. We didn't have the 2,157 target till the new London plan was published and adopted. Before then, if I remember rightly, we had a target of about 1,300, and before that was about 900 a year. So people misunderstand. There is a need for homes throughout London, and we are a London borough. We're not the government of the country, so we have to follow the laws as laid out by the London plan and also the NPPF, which is central government. We are just one local planning authority, so we have to follow some regulations which are laid out. And I'm afraid we're not able to force people to build things. We're only a local council. We can give permission to people to build homes, and if they don't build them, after 3 years, the permission lapses unless they start some work on the site. But that's only minor, and that's again national regulations. It's not local regulations that we can change. So all we can try and do as a local planning authority is to make sure that we follow national and regional policy to try and deliver homes for our residents, generally affordable homes as far as possible. But again, we're in the hands of national government. That causes all sorts of issues around taking away housing targets from the shires and piling that pressure onto the 20 largest cities. So they want us to build 4,000, which is crazy. But we have to do what we can. But I think our residents need to understand we are not all powerful. We can't make people build. We can give them permission, and we will try to do the best we can for our residents as we seen through our housing strategy around where we try and give permission for homes to be built. But homes have to be built, otherwise we have that tilted balance issues. So that's where we are. We're not in control of our destiny. We are one local planning authority, and we have to follow the London plan and national policy. Otherwise, we get the tilted balance. And as Michael Grove has threatened 9 local planning authorities, because they're not actually really meeting their targets, to take over from them and actually carry out the planning function through national government rather than through local authorities. Because that's what happens in the end, is if a local planning authority doesn't follow and doesn't do that job properly, they get taken over and somebody else runs that planning department on behalf of the national government. And that's what he's threatening to do if you don't meet the targets. So it's really difficult time, but we are trying to do the best we can.
Thank you, Councillor Munro, for conclude these questions. And thank you for everyone to attending this meeting this evening. And as you know, this is the last meeting in the current committee cycle, subject to the members' level sign off. It is expected to that council will publish its local plan final proposal Reg 19 in January 2024. So just still there is a time to give us input. We are meeting with the residents, we are meeting with different community groups next week and the coming weeks and months. So there is still opportunity. So thank you very much once again for being a part of this meeting. We are finishing that meeting on that point. And if we will not see you before that, wishing you a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you very much, and meeting is finished now.